So, how do we actually know if a massive government spending plan is working, or if a central bank's big interest rate hike is really taming inflation? You see, economists need a reliable way to map out the future. And for years, their tools were, well, surprisingly fragile. Today, we're going to break down a brilliantly direct method that completely changed the game: local projections. Okay, think about it. When a central bank raises interest rates to fight inflation, or a government rolls out a huge spending package to kickstart the economy, these are not small moves. But how on earth can we trace the real impact of that one and single decision through all the noise of a multi-trillion-dollar economy? See, the thing is, these effects don't just happen overnight. There's always a chain reaction. A policy shock today creates these ripples that travel through time. So to really judge if a policy actually worked, we need a reliable map of those ripples. We have to measure not just the initial splash, but how the waves evolve way down the road. And that map, it actually has a name. It's called an impulse response. An impulse response function basically tracks the effect of one variable shock, that's the impulse, on another variable over time. You can think of it as the economist's version of a slow-motion replay of cause and effect. But here's the catch. For a very long time, creating this kind of reliable map was a huge, huge challenge. And to understand why, we've got to look at how economists used to try and solve this problem, and where those classic methods kept running into trouble. At a high level, you can really boil it down to two totally different philosophies. The old way was to try and build one giant, super intricate model of the entire economy to predict the whole path of that ripple effect all at once. The new way, as we're about to see, is much more direct and, in a good way, a lot less ambitious. So the traditional tool for this is something called a vector autoregression, or just VAR for short. The key idea behind a VAR is that, everything is connected. The future of inflation depends on the past of inflation and unemployment and interest rates, and the future of unemployment depends on the past of all those things too. It's this completely interconnected system. And this gives us a great way to picture it. A VAR is like trying to map an entire country's train network. If you want to predict a journey from point A to point Z, you literally need to know the location of every single track, every single switch, and every connection along the way. The model for the whole journey depends on getting every single piece exactly right. And here's where the problems really start. If you get just one tiny switch wrong early on, if your model is just slightly off, that error doesn't just go away. Oh no. It compounds. It sends the train down the wrong track, and the further out you try to predict, the more lost you get. And this is a massive problem because economists almost never have perfect, gigantic data sets to work with. So, this fragility, this whole train network problem, it really led to a major shift in thinking. Economists needed a totally new approach, and what they found was the local projection. Now, the logic here is almost shockingly simple. Instead of building one massive model for the whole journey, you just ask a series of direct questions. Want to know the impact 1 year from now? Okay. You run a simple statistical analysis, a regression, that looks at the data and only estimates that 1 year effect. Done. Now, what about the impact in 2 years? You don't even touch that first model. You run a brand new, completely separate analysis just for that 2 year point, and you just keep doing that for every single point in the future. And this just perfectly illustrates the difference, right? Local projections are not a train network. They are a series of direct flights. Each point in the future is its own destination. So a mistake in calculating the flight path to your 1 year destination has absolutely zero bearing on the calculation for your 2 year destination. They are totally separate, robust, and direct. So why is this direct flight approach actually better in the real world? I mean, it sounds simpler, sure, but is it more accurate? Well, let's see what happens when you put these two methods head-to-head with the kind of messy, limited data that economists are always working with. And the results are, well, they're pretty striking. This chart shows the amount of estimation bias, which is basically how wrong the models are on average when you're using smaller, more realistic data sets. The old method, the VAR, it suffers from a lot of bias. But local projections, the bias is dramatically lower. They just give you a more reliable answer. Plain and simple. The researchers who pioneered this work put it perfectly. They found that local projections have what they call a doubly robust property. Now that's a fancy term, but what it means is they're less biased and their estimates are more trustworthy, even when your underlying model of the economy isn't perfect, which, let's be honest, it never is. So at the end of the day, what this all means is that local projections are just more forgiving. They're more robust.
You don't have to model every single switch in that train network perfectly. Because each estimate is its own direct flight, small errors don't compound and throw your entire forecast way off course. It's just a more resilient way to map out the future.
Okay, so this is a more robust statistical tool. That's great for academics, sure, but why should the rest of us care? Let's bring this all the way back to our first question about understanding economic policy in the real world. Well, it means that policymakers now have a toolkit that's simpler to use, much more reliable when things are uncertain, and it's incredibly flexible. Because it's just a series of simple analyses, you can easily adapt it to ask really complex questions like, hey, does an interest rate hike have a bigger effect during a recession than during a boom? That kind of thing is really, really hard to do with a rigid VAR model. And this isn't just some theory, you know? Local projections have become a go-to method in modern economics. They're being used right now by researchers at central banks and governments all over the world to analyze the real-world impact of the biggest economic decisions. We're talking interest rates, government spending, taxes, the whole shebang. This tool is actively shaping how we understand the economy. And that leaves us with a pretty fascinating final thought. We started this whole thing looking for a map of economic ripple effects. What we found was not just a better map, but a better way of map making, one that's simpler, more direct, and frankly, more honest about what we don't know. So the question becomes, with these clearer, more robust tools to chart the consequences of our actions, what critical economic puzzles will we finally be able to solve next?